Soviet spies couldn't believe American supermarkets had 50 types of cereal. Moscow, January 1960. The frost bites deep. Inside a nondescript building on Dzerzhinsky Square, a man named Yuri Bezmenov sits across from his superior, studying photographs that seem impossible. The images show endless shelves stretching into fluorescent infinity, each one packed with boxes in colors so bright they appear hand-painted. His superior slides another photograph across the desk. Yuri counts the varieties visible in this single frame. 12, 15, 20 different breakfast cereals, each promising something different: crunch, sweetness, nutrition, adventure. The man across from him watches carefully, waiting for the reaction that always comes: disbelief, then suspicion, then the inevitable conclusion: American propaganda, surely. Elaborate staging for the cameras. No society could sustain such waste, such absurd variety. Yuri nods, makes his notes, and files the photographs away with all the other intelligence materials that paint America as a land of carefully constructed illusions. But the photographs were real. And in the coming years, as Soviet intelligence officers, diplomats, journalists, and defectors found themselves walking through actual American supermarkets, the cognitive dissonance would prove more destabilizing than any military threat. The Cold War was fought with missiles and proxies, with ideology and espionage, but it was also fought in the aisles of grocery stores, where the simple act of choosing between 50 types of cereal became a philosophical crisis for those raised to believe such abundance was impossible, immoral, or both. The Soviet Union had spent 4 decades constructing an elaborate worldview in which scarcity was noble, choice was unnecessary, and American prosperity was a thin veneer covering exploitation and suffering. Soviet citizens learned from childhood that their system, despite its hardships, represented humanity's future, while American capitalism was a dying beast, hollowing itself out through greed. The propaganda was sophisticated, pervasive, and internally consistent. It had to be. Because the alternative, that the capitalist enemy had somehow created a society of genuine abundance, was too dangerous to contemplate. The year 1959 marked a turning point. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev became the first Soviet leader to visit the United States, and his journey would expose him to realities that no amount of ideological training had prepared him for. His handlers in Moscow had briefed him extensively on what to expect: staged prosperity, carefully selected showcase neighborhoods, actors playing the role of satisfied citizens. Khrushchev himself believed he could see through the performance. He was a peasant's son who had risen through cunning and political instinct. He would not be fooled by American theatrics. The American supermarket that Khrushchev visited in September 1959 was not a specially prepared showpiece. It was a standard Safeway in San Francisco, selected precisely because it was ordinary. His American hosts understood something profound. The truth was more powerful than any propaganda. When Khrushchev walked through those automatic doors, another small marvel that drew his attention, he entered a space that contradicted everything he thought he knew about economic systems and human organization. The cereal aisle stretched before him like a monument to excess. Cornflakes and Rice Krispies, Cheerios and Wheaties, Sugar Pops and Cocoa Puffs. Each box promised something different, targeted a different consumer, told a different story. There were cereals for children with cartoon characters dancing across the packaging, cereals for athletes emphasizing strength and vitality, cereals for health-conscious adults boasting fiber and vitamins, cereals that were little more than sugar and air, marketed as pure indulgence. The sheer variety was dizzying, and this was just one category in one aisle of a medium-sized store that contained thousands upon thousands of products. Khrushchev stopped walking. His interpreter and the American officials accompanying him waited as the premier reached out and picked up a box of cornflakes. He turned it over in his hands, studying the nutritional information, the bright rooster logo, the proclamation of fortified with essential vitamins and minerals. He asked how much it cost. When told, he calculated quickly. The price represented perhaps 2 hours of labor for an average American worker. In the Soviet Union, a comparable product, when available, might cost a full day's wages, and citizens would queue for hours for the privilege of purchasing it. But it was not just the price that troubled him. It was the casual abundance of it all. The store was not crowded with desperate shoppers fighting over limited supplies. People moved leisurely through the aisles, comparing products, reading labels, making choices based on preference rather than availability. Women pushed shopping carts, another innovation that fascinated the Soviet observers, filled with items that represented not subsistence, but genuine selection. A family might buy 3 different types of cereal because different family members preferred different tastes. This was not survival shopping. This was something else entirely. The Soviet delegation spent 45 minutes in that supermarket, and the experience would haunt many of them for years. They examined the produce section, where fruits and vegetables from across the continent and beyond sat in neat pyramids, each piece uniform and unblemished. They studied the meat counter, where steaks and roasts lay wrapped in clean plastic, priced and labeled, available to anyone with money to spend. They wandered through aisles of canned goods, frozen foods, dairy products, baked goods, and household items, each category offering dozens or hundreds of variations on a theme. One member of the delegation, a mid-level official named Alexander Shelepin, found himself standing in front of the breakfast cereal section for several minutes after the rest of the group had moved on. He counted 47 different varieties within his field of vision, and he could see that the aisle continued beyond where he stood. 47 ways to begin the day. 47 different combinations of grains, sugars, shapes, and marketing promises. In Moscow, there might be 2 or 3 types of kasha available in a given week, and citizens considered themselves fortunate when the stores were stocked at all. Shelepin had been trained in Marxist-Leninist theory at the highest levels. He understood the dialectical materialism that explained why capitalism must inevitably collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. He had studied the statistics showing American poverty, unemployment, and inequality. He knew that behind this facade of abundance lay exploitation of workers, imperialism abroad, and a society rotting from within. But standing in that cereal aisle, his theoretical certainty wavered. If this was a facade, it was extraordinarily elaborate. If this was propaganda, someone had gone to remarkable lengths to stock a random supermarket with actual products that actual people could actually purchase. The cognitive dissonance was not unique to Shelepin. It was a phenomenon that repeated itself throughout the Cold War whenever Soviet officials encountered American consumer culture directly. The pattern was consistent: initial skepticism, careful observation, dawning realization, and then a difficult psychological adjustment. Some resolved the dissonance by doubling down on ideology, convincing themselves that material abundance was spiritually empty or morally corrupt. Others began to question everything they had been taught. A few, like Yuri Bezmenov, who would later defect to the West, found that the experience fundamentally altered their understanding of the world. The cereal aisle became, in the years that followed, a recurring symbol in defector testimonies and intelligence reports. It represented something more than breakfast options. It embodied a fundamental difference in how the two systems conceptualized human needs and desires. In the Soviet model, a single type of cereal was sufficient. The state determined what citizens needed, produced it efficiently, and distributed it equally. Choice was unnecessary, even wasteful. Resources spent developing 47 types of cereal could be better used building tanks or power plants or apartment blocks. But the American model operated on different principles. Choice itself was valuable. Competition between cereal manufacturers drove innovation, lowered prices, and responded to consumer preferences. The proliferation of varieties was not waste, but evidence of a responsive economic system that treated individual preferences as legitimate and important. Child who wanted sweeter cereal, an adult who preferred whole grains, an athlete seeking protein, each could find a product tailored to their specific desires. This was capitalism functioning as its theorists claimed it should, creating abundance through competition and meeting diverse needs through market mechanisms. Soviet intelligence services struggled to make sense of this reality. Reports from agents in America consistently described a level of consumer abundance that seemed implausible to analysts in Moscow. Photographs and film footage were dismissed as staged or exceptional. The KGB developed elaborate theories about how Americans maintained the illusion of prosperity. Perhaps the stores were only stocked when foreign visitors were present. Perhaps the shoppers were actors. Perhaps the products were empty boxes designed to impress. These theories persisted even as more and more Soviet officials visited America and returned with the same bewildering accounts. In 1962, a Soviet journalist named Viktor Nekrasov published a travel essay about his visit to America that included a detailed description of a supermarket. He wrote about the cereal aisle with a mixture of wonder and unease, noting that the abundance was almost offensive, as if they were mocking those of us who had known real hunger. His essay was controversial in Moscow. Some readers accused him of being seduced by American propaganda. Others wrote letters thanking him for his honesty, admitting they had suspected the truth but lacked the courage to voice it. The personal transformation that occurred in individuals who experienced this cognitive dissonance was often profound and painful. These were people who had dedicated their lives to building and defending the Soviet system. They had believed genuinely and deeply in the superiority of their social model. They had sacrificed comfort, sometimes family, often personal freedom, in service of an ideology that promised a better future for all humanity. And then they stood in an American supermarket, surrounded by 50 types of cereal, and felt the foundation of their worldview crack. One such individual was Boris Klossin, a Soviet diplomat stationed in Washington during the early 1960s. His job was to report on American society, to identify weaknesses and contradictions that could be exploited. He approached the task with professional diligence, visiting supermarkets regularly to document prices and availability. His reports back to Moscow were careful and factual, but between the lines, his growing doubt was evident. He noted that prices remained stable over time. He observed that even working-class neighborhoods had well-stocked stores. He documented that the variety of products increased rather than decreased, suggesting the abundance was not temporary or artificial. In his private diary, which would not be discovered until after the Cold War ended, Klossin wrote more honestly about his experience. "Today I counted 53 types of breakfast cereal in a single store," he recorded in March 1963. "I tried to calculate how many man-hours of labor went into developing, producing, packaging, and distributing these products. The number was staggering. And yet the system works. People buy what they want. Stores remain stocked. No queues, no shortages, no ration cards. How is this possible? What have we been wrong about?" The cereal box itself became a kind of Rosetta Stone for understanding American culture. Soviet analysts studied the packaging with the intensity of archaeologists examining ancient artifacts. The bright colors and cartoon characters revealed a society that celebrated childhood and indulged children's preferences. The nutritional labeling suggested a population concerned with health and informed about diet. The variety of brand names indicated a competitive marketplace where multiple companies could coexist and profit. The English-language slogans, part of a complete breakfast, fortified with vitamins, kid-tested, mother-approved, encoded assumptions about family structure, gender roles, and consumer decision-making. What disturbed Soviet observers most was not the abundance itself, but the casualness with which Americans treated it. Shoppers did not marvel at the selection or express gratitude for the availability of so many options. They simply chose what they wanted, often quickly and without much deliberation, as if having 50 types of cereal was the most natural thing in the world. This casual attitude toward abundance suggested something deeper than mere material wealth. It suggested a society that had internalized the expectation of plenty, that assumed as a baseline condition what Soviet citizens could barely imagine. The broader impact of these supermarket encounters rippled through Soviet society in ways both obvious and subtle. Diplomats and journalists who had visited America shared their experiences with family and friends, spreading information that contradicted official propaganda. Some became more cynical about their own system, seeing the shortages and queues at home with new eyes. Others became more defensive, arguing that material abundance was spiritually empty or that Americans were slaves to consumerism. But few could return to the simple certainties they had held before witnessing American supermarkets firsthand. The phenomenon even affected Soviet economic planning. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, there were tentative efforts to introduce more consumer choice into the Soviet system. State factories began producing multiple varieties of some products, though the selection remained limited by Western standards. Supermarket-style stores called gastronomes were opened in major cities, attempting to replicate some aspects of the American shopping experience. These reforms were half-hearted and ultimately unsuccessful, but they represented an acknowledgement that consumer satisfaction mattered, that people wanted choices, and that the Soviet system was failing to meet basic expectations. The psychological impact on individual Soviet officials who experienced American supermarkets cannot be overstated. Many of these men and women had grown up during the hardships of World War II, when hunger was a constant companion and survival itself was uncertain. They had rebuilt their country from ruins, believing that their sacrifices were building a better world. The Communist Party had promised them that their children would live in abundance, that the Soviet system would eventually surpass the West in every measure of prosperity and happiness. These were not empty promises to those who believed them. They were the meaning and purpose of their lives. When Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador to the United States from 1962 to 1986, first visited an American supermarket in the early days of his posting, he was accompanied by his wife and teenage son. His son, who had been raised on stories of American poverty and deprivation, stood transfixed in the cereal aisle. The boy reached out tentatively to touch a box of Fruit Loops, as if testing whether it was real. The bright colors, the cartoon toucan, the promise of fruity flavors, it was all so foreign to his experience. Dobrynin watched his son's face and saw there a mixture of wonder and confusion that he recognized in himself. How could he explain this to the boy? How could he maintain the narrative of Soviet superiority when the evidence before their eyes told a different story? Dobrynin, like many Soviet diplomats, developed a kind of double consciousness. In his official reports and public statements, he maintained the party line. American abundance was built on exploitation, inequality was rampant, the capitalist system was inherently unstable and would eventually collapse. But in private conversations with trusted colleagues, and in his own thoughts, he grappled with uncomfortable questions. If the American system was so flawed, why did it produce such abundance? If capitalism was dying, why did it seem so vibrant and dynamic? If the Soviet system was superior, why could it not provide its citizens with even a fraction of the consumer choices available to ordinary Americans? These questions became more urgent as the Cold War progressed, and the gap between Soviet and American living standards widened rather than narrowed. The 1970s brought the era of détente, increased cultural exchange, and more opportunities for Soviet citizens to visit the West. Each visit to an American supermarket reinforced the same uncomfortable reality. The abundance was not propaganda. The variety was not staged. The casual prosperity was genuine and widespread. Soviet economists tried to explain away the disparity. They argued that the Soviet Union prioritized heavy industry and military production over consumer goods, and that this was a rational choice given the need to defend against Western aggression. They pointed out that the Soviet system provided free healthcare, education, and housing, benefits that Americans had to purchase out of their own pockets. They emphasized that Soviet society was more equal, without the extremes of wealth and poverty visible in American cities. All of these arguments had some validity, but they could not fully account for the emotional and psychological impact of standing in a cereal aisle and confronting abundance on a scale that seemed almost magical. The cereal aisle also revealed something about the nature of innovation and competition in capitalist systems. Each new cereal variety represented not just a product, but an entire chain of innovation. Food scientists experimenting with flavors and textures, marketing professionals studying consumer preferences, graphic designers creating appealing packaging, distribution networks ensuring nationwide availability. The system incentivized this innovation because companies that better satisfied consumer desires earned higher profits. This created a feedback loop of continuous improvement and diversification that the Soviet command economy, with its centralized planning and lack of market signals, could not replicate. Soviet planners understood this problem intellectually, but could not solve it practically. The command economy was designed to produce large quantities of standardized goods efficiently. It excelled at manufacturing tanks, building dams, and launching satellites, projects with clear specifications and centralized control. But it struggled with the messy complexity of consumer preferences, where success required responding to thousands of individual choices and constantly adapting to changing tastes. The cereal aisle was a microcosm of this larger failure. The Soviet system could produce cereal, but it could not produce the variety, quality, and responsiveness that characterized American consumer markets. By the 1980s, the supermarket experience had become a standard part of the Soviet disillusionment narrative. Defectors routinely cited their first visit to an American grocery store as a turning point in their thinking. The writer Vasily Aksyonov, who emigrated from the Soviet Union in 1980, described his first American supermarket visit as like stepping into a dream, except the dream was real and my previous reality was the illusion. The physicist Yuri Orlov, imprisoned in the Soviet Union for his human rights activism and later exchanged to the West, wrote that the cereal aisle contained more genuine choice than the entire Soviet political system. These testimonies accumulated and circulated, both in the West and, through underground networks, in the Soviet Union itself. They contributed to a growing awareness among Soviet citizens that their system was failing them in fundamental ways. The official propaganda became increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of mounting evidence. When Soviet television showed carefully curated images of American poverty and social problems, viewers increasingly recognized these as selective presentations designed to obscure larger truths. The credibility gap between official narratives and lived reality grew wider each year. The introduction of glasnost under Mikhail Gorbachev in the mid-1980s finally allowed open discussion of these long-suppressed realities. Soviet journalists began publishing honest accounts of American living standards, including detailed descriptions of supermarkets and consumer abundance. These articles were sensational, not because they revealed new information — many Soviet citizens had suspected the truth — but because they represented official acknowledgement of what had long been denied. The cereal aisle, with its 50 varieties, became a symbol of everything the Soviet system had promised but failed to deliver. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, one of the most striking images was of East Germans flooding into West Berlin supermarkets, overwhelmed by the abundance they found there. They stood in cereal aisles, just as Soviet officials had done decades earlier, trying to comprehend the reality before them. Many wept, not just from joy at their newfound freedom, but from grief at the years of deprivation they had endured unnecessarily. The cereal boxes, in their absurd variety, represented both the triumph of the West and the tragedy of the East, a visual representation of the opportunity cost of failed ideology. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought rapid transformation to Russian consumer markets. Western products, including American breakfast cereals, flooded into Russian stores. For the first time, ordinary Russian citizens could experience the supermarket abundance that had once been the exclusive province of diplomats and intelligence officers. The initial reaction was often similar to what Soviet officials had experienced in America: disbelief, wonder, and a sense of being overwhelmed by choice. Russian shoppers, accustomed to scarcity and limited options, now faced the same dizzying array of breakfast cereals that had troubled their predecessors. But the transition was not entirely smooth or positive. The sudden introduction of market capitalism brought its own problems: inflation, unemployment, inequality, and the loss of social safety nets that had provided basic security under the Soviet system. Some Russians looked back nostalgically to the Soviet era, when life was harder but simpler, when choices were limited but certainties were clear. The cereal aisle, once a symbol of Western superiority, became more ambiguous, representing both the promise of freedom and the anxiety of choice, both the abundance of capitalism and its inequalities. This complexity reflected a larger truth about the Cold War and its legacy. The supermarket encounters that had so troubled Soviet officials were not simple morality tales about the triumph of one system over another. They were windows into fundamental questions about human nature, social organization, and what constitutes a good life. The 50 types of cereal represented genuine abundance and genuine choice, but they also represented a consumer culture that could seem shallow and materialistic, an economic system that generated waste alongside wealth, and a society that prioritized individual satisfaction over collective welfare. The Soviet officials who experienced cognitive dissonance in American supermarkets were grappling with these complexities, even if they could not fully articulate them. They recognized that the abundance they witnessed was real and impressive, but they also intuited that it came with costs and trade-offs. The American system had solved the problem of production and distribution in ways the Soviet system had not, but it had created new problems around inequality, consumerism, and environmental sustainability. The cereal aisle was both a triumph and a warning, both an achievement to admire and a phenomenon to question. Epilogue. The cereal box sits in a museum now, preserved behind glass as an artifact of a vanished conflict. It is a simple object, cardboard and ink, the ghost of a breakfast long consumed, but it carries within it the weight of empires and the dreams of millions. Visitors pause before it, reading the faded label, trying to understand why something so ordinary once seemed so significant. The answer lies not in the object itself, but in what it represented. The power of abundance to challenge ideology, the ability of simple material facts to undermine complex theoretical systems. The human hunger, not just for sustenance, but for choice. The Soviet officials who stood in American supermarkets, counting cereal varieties and struggling to reconcile what they saw with what they believed, were not fools or villains. They were people caught between competing visions of human possibility, between the world they had been taught to expect and the world that actually existed. Their disbelief was understandable, even rational given their training and experience. The real world, it turned out, was stranger and more complex than either capitalist or communist ideology had predicted. The cereal aisle teaches us something profound about the nature of freedom and its relationship to material conditions. We cannot be fully free when we are hungry, when our choices are constrained by scarcity, when our energies are consumed by the struggle for survival, The abundance that so troubled Soviet observers was not merely about having 50 types of cereal, it was about having the security and prosperity that make genuine choice possible. It was about living in a society wealthy enough that people could make decisions based on preference rather than necessity, on taste rather than availability. But the cereal aisle also teaches us about the limits and costs of abundance. The 50 varieties represent not just choice but waste, not just prosperity but environmental impact, not just freedom but the anxiety and confusion that can come from too many options. The American system that produced this abundance also produced inequality, exploitation, and ecological damage. The Soviet officials who questioned whether 50 types of cereal were necessary were not entirely wrong. There is something absurd about such proliferation, something that suggests a society that has lost sight of genuine needs in pursuit of artificial wants. The truth, as always, is more complex than propaganda from either side admitted. The Cold War was not simply a contest between good and evil, between freedom and tyranny, between abundance and scarcity. It was a struggle between different visions of how to organize human society, each with its own strengths and failures, each with its own insights and blind spots. The supermarket encounters that troubled Soviet officials revealed the failures of the communist system, but they also hinted at the limitations and costs of the capitalist alternative. What remains, after the ideologies have faded and the empires have fallen, is the human dimension of the story. The Soviet officials who experienced cognitive dissonance in American supermarkets were people like us, trying to make sense of a complex world, struggling to reconcile belief and evidence, seeking meaning and purpose in their lives. Their transformation, from certainty to doubt, from ideology to questioning, is a universal human experience. We all encounter moments when reality challenges our assumptions, when the world refuses to conform to our expectations, when we must choose between comfortable illusions and uncomfortable truths. The cereal box, in its museum case, reminds us that history is made not just by great leaders and dramatic events, but by ordinary objects and everyday experiences. A box of cornflakes helped end an empire not through any inherent power, but by representing a reality that ideology could not explain away. The abundance of a supermarket aisle proved more powerful than nuclear weapons because it spoke to basic human desires and demonstrated practical possibilities that theory denied. In the end, the story of Soviet spies and American cereal is a story about the stubborn persistence of truth in the face of propaganda, about the power of material reality to challenge abstract ideology, and about the universal human longing not just for survival but for satisfaction, not just for equality but for choice, not just for security but for the freedom to select one's own breakfast cereal. These are small freedoms, perhaps, but they are real ones, and their absence is felt as keenly as the absence of larger political liberties. The Cold War is over, but the questions it raised remain relevant. How do we balance abundance with sustainability? How do we provide choice without creating anxiety? How do we achieve prosperity without sacrificing equality? How do we honor individual preferences while maintaining social solidarity? The cereal aisle cannot answer these questions, but it can remind us of their importance and their complexity. And so the cereal box sits in its museum case, a humble monument to a grand conflict, a simple object that once shook empires and troubled the sleep of those who believed they understood the world. It reminds us that truth is often found in ordinary places, that ideology must ultimately answer to reality, and that human beings, whatever their political system, hunger for both bread and the freedom to choose how that bread is served.